You're here because you know something, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there.
Don't worry, don't be afraid, ever. This is just a rhyme.
Vibrations, I'm picking up vibrations, I'm picking up vibrations, I'm picking up vibrations.
You're with Good Vibrations, hosted by myself, Mark Devlin, and we're now going out via freemantv.com, a brand new portal, a brand new outlet for these podcasts, and a new working association with Freeman, who is going to be a character very familiar to many listeners to this series. I'm looking forward to collaborating with him on getting this information out and releasing lots of great speakers, reflecting on many of the subjects that we like to get into. There's lots of common ground between us. So a big welcome to everyone joining us via freemantv.com. This is a topical and timely edition today as we approach the 15th anniversary of a world-changing event by anybody's standards. 9/11, September 11th, 2001 is a date that is going to live on in the consciousness of anyone that was alive in those times in terms of the legacy and the impact that it's had on everyone's lives in the world, really. And there's both good and bad aspects to that. And this is a two-parter. The second edition is going to be with Max Egan. Watch out for that next time around. We're going to be crossing over to Peru to get his perspectives on things. Today, we're talking to Ian Crane, who is a guy that's got many reflections and aspects to offer on what 9/11 has meant to the world at large. On the line is Ian Crane, who last guested in 2013. Good to have you back, Ian.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for the invitation.
Just to set the tone for the whole thing, Tony Blair is a man not generally known for telling the truth, but possibly the only truthful thing he ever said in his career is when he said a while back that the world changed forever on September 11th, 2001. And I think many people will be able to relate to that statement. Ian, I know you've related an anecdote about this in some of your previous interviews, but it probably bears some repeating here. Maybe you just want to recap on what that event meant to you and how it changed your perception of things.
Well, many geopolitical analysts, although at the time I, was still sort of in my infancy in my research, but, I was in Central America through much of 2001, and I was actually in Belize in a little community called Plasencia on the morning of 9/11. And over the previous sort of 3-4 months or so, I'd been sort of regaling people, with my observations that, something very, very significant was about to take place. I had no idea what it was. And a big part of my thinking on that was the fact that having lived and worked in the US, I've got a pretty good understanding of how US politics works. And, the one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the US president actually has very, very little to do in terms of domestic politics, because each of the states in the US actually has more autonomy than any country does within the EU. So the states are, relatively self-governing. And obviously there is an element of federal law, as a raft of federal law, but the role of the president is much more outward-facing. And since George W. Bush was manipulated into the White House, and of course he'd been manipulated in there by the infamous hanging chads, i.e., it all came down to Florida, where coincidentally his brother was governor at the time.
Just a coincidence.
Just coincidence, yeah. And so it was Florida that effectively came down to the determination of whether or not he should be appointed president. And of course the controversy didn't end there, because it actually went to the Supreme Court, where I think it was 5-3 ruled in his favor over Al Gore. So, he was effectively put into office by the Supreme Court as opposed to the American people. But since he was sworn in on the White House lawn in January of 2001, he had actually only been in Washington for 19 days in the period between being sworn in and the events of 9/11. Right. And for a US president to be effectively sitting on the bench or actually in his case, he was primarily sitting either on his ranch in Crawford, Texas, or on a golf course. But to be completely out of the picture, I mean, he was obviously not particularly well versed in the international arena. He'd barely been outside of the US in his entire life. And so, I sensed that he was being groomed. He was being prepared for something. And like many people on that fateful Tuesday morning, I was sitting in the bar called the Purple Space Monkey in Plasencia, which was my regular breakfast haunt. And I was watching the events unfold on CNN. And I, regret to say, but when the second tower fell, I knew at that point that there was something not right about this event, and I jumped up where I was having breakfast, and I said, "This is it. This is it. This is the event I've been talking about. This is the event that George Bush has been being groomed for the last 9 months."
Right.
And I obviously at that time it didn't occur to me that it was false flag or anything like that. I just knew that this was a staged event of some way, shape, or form to bring about the neocon agenda, because I was familiar with the document which had been published exactly 1 year earlier in September 2000, Rebuilding America's Defenses by the PNAC Group, Project for New American Century.
Yeah.
And of course, 9/11 was effectively the catastrophic and catalytic event that the neocons needed to trigger their hegemonic agenda for global control.
Yeah. The new Pearl Harbor, as they put it themselves in that document.
They did indeed, the new Pearl Harbor. And by the way, that document was pretty much plagiarized from Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, which he published in 1997. And of course, Brzezinski has been the sort of democratic version of Henry Kissinger. When the Republicans were in office, then Kissinger tended to be very much at the forefront of foreign policy, and when the Democrats were, it was Brzezinski. Yeah. But Clinton didn't like Brzezinski, so Clinton kept Brzezinski away from the White House and pushed him back into academia. And he wrote a few books during the Clinton years, but the seminal book is The Grand Chessboard. And The Grand Chessboard is still primarily the neocon blueprint for what the U.S. hegemonic agenda is still trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
I mean, September the 11th is a trigger date. If we look at the geopolitical events that have occurred on September the 11th, I mean, that was the date of in 1973, the Chilean coup, which put Pinochet in office over Salvador Allende. It was, I believe, the date also of the Iranian coup, which took out Mossadegh and put the Shah in situ in 1979. I mean, September the 11th, obviously has a significant. I mean, the Pentagon, the cornerstone of the Pentagon, was laid on a September the 11th. I don't remember which year off the top of my head, but yeah, September the 11th is certainly, like April the 19th, is a day to watch out for.
Yeah, it's also said to be the day that Paul McCartney was replaced, but we're not going to go there in this interview. That's for another time. So, to my shame, I have to say that when the events of 9/11 went down in 2001, I did swallow the official story hook, line and sinker, as many other people did, and probably a lot of people listening to this podcast who now know better would have been in that mind state at the time. I was very much a kind of sleeping, mind-controlled drone back then. So,
well, don't beat yourself up over that, Mark, though, because I mean, that was the case, and in the immediate weeks and months after 9/11. Now, as it happens, coincidentally, I was scheduled to fly back from Central America to Europe on September the 15th of 2001. And as it happens, it all worked out because I was due to fly from Guatemala City, but because all the airlines were not flying into the US. So I changed my flights and I flew direct from Belize to Europe. And once I got back into the UK, I started to do a little bit of digging, and I wasn't getting very far initially, but I certainly had this sense that things, really weren't right. I didn't know anything really about Building 7 at that time, not straight away. The thing that struck me really was the Pentagon. The thing that didn't add up was the Pentagon. I wasn't yet into the arena of controlled demolition in any way, shape or form. But, it was very clear that the Pentagon had not been hit by a plane. Just looking at the images, and by the way, I probably have one of the most significant portfolios of photographs and video footage from that day, because I was collecting it at that time. And there was literally only about, half a dozen or so, certainly people that I was aware of who were actually looking at this in the same way that I was. And it was a small community, and we were sharing as much information as we could glean. But it became very apparent that, one, there was no plane there. The lawn wasn't damaged at all. Listening to the eyewitness reports, the eyewitnesses who were close by said that they saw what looked like a missile, a small plane, a commuter plane, a fighter jet. Everybody saw something different, as is always the case. But for those who were within about a 400-meter radius, they all saw something that was small. Once you start to get beyond that 400-meter radius, then people saw a commercial jet. And I know exactly what happened. And I first, discussed this or released this, I think, back in 2005, because my hypothesis was corroborated when a young engineering student at Oxford Brookes University managed to secure the black box data that was allegedly from Flight 77. And although he got the black box data, whoever gave it to him clearly didn't anticipate his tenacity in getting hold of the software to actually decode it. And what he was able to establish from the black box data that had been provided to him by the authorities in the US was that the plane from which that black box came overflew the Pentagon at a height of 170 feet. And so what I conjectured occurred was that we know that whatever hit the Pentagon descended by 7,000 feet whilst turning through 270 degrees, a maneuver that airline pilots have said is absolutely impossible, because even though the plane might be able to withstand those kind of stresses, the pilot would black out. But so whatever hit the Pentagon, let's say for the purpose of the discussion that it was a missile, because it certainly looks that way. So it descended by 7,000 feet, turning through 270 degrees, and it was perfectly timed to fly under one of the planes that was coming into land at Ronald Reagan International Airport, which is literally situated directly behind the Pentagon. And as you will recall, all flights after the attacks on the Twin Towers, all flights had been instructed to land at the nearest airport, nearest suitable, available airport at the earliest possible opportunity. Right. So this was contrived to fly under that flight, which explains why people who were close up saw the missile, the small plane, the commuter jet, the fighter jet, whatever, and the people who were further away saw the larger plane, because what the people who were further away saw was that larger plane that was flying and on the way to landing at Ronald Reagan International Airport. And then when we look at the evidence of the Pentagon, first of all, the roof didn't collapse until some 20 minutes after the impact. Still, hardly any wreckage whatsoever on the lawn, and the lawn was immaculate. There wasn't anything to show that anything untoward had occurred there. It was like a putting green. And of course, we have a single hole, and it was a twin-engine jet, allegedly. And if you look at the engineering involved here, what's providing the forward thrust is the titanium jet engines. That's what's providing the forward thrust. The fuselage is simply a hollow tube. And because the Pentagon, and of course that particular wing of the Pentagon, had only just had a major refurbishment completed, because the Pentagon is not just 5 wings, it's also five layers of building. And this particular part of the Pentagon had been through a major refurbishment, and all the walls had been reinforced, coincidentally. And, so whatever hit the Pentagon created a single point of entry, and it drilled through 3 of the 5 layers of reinforced concrete. And of course, the picture of the exit hole is in the public domain. But just think about it. What should have happened is the fuselage should have crumpled as it collided with the reinforced outer wall of the Pentagon, and the 2 titanium jet engines, which were providing the forward thrust, those 2 jet engines should have drilled into the walls of the Pentagon. So, I don't profess to know precisely what occurred at the Pentagon, but we know what didn't occur, and the reality is that a commercial plane did not hit the Pentagon.
Yeah. It seems the only consistent point in any of this is that the official version is a crock of crap from start to finish. So you start there and build upwards. It seems a pretty good starting point to me. So you were mentioning there George W. Bush, and we were questioning whether he was ushered in specifically to be at the helm, or at least be the figurehead for this event. It's often seemed to me that this event was ideally timed for him being brought in. But I wonder how much of this stuff he was complicit in. And it does make me wonder whether inside knowledge of the fine detail that was going to go down that day was deliberately kept from him. I mean, I'm mindful of the footage that we have of him reading the pet goat story in the school. And an advisor comes up to him and whispers in his ear, obviously letting him know of what's going on. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I concur. I don't think for 1 minute that George W. Bush knew what was unfolding or going to unfold that day. I have a sense that he had been primed that something would happen, because otherwise the guy was just sitting on the bench. I mean, the guy was the most inactive U.S. president ever. Like I said, he was primarily either on his ranch in Crawford or playing golf. Just 19 days in Washington over a period of nearly 9 months.
Yeah.
So there's no way that he could have believed that he was fulfilling the role of President of the United States of America.
Yeah.
So he was shunted off to Florida, and of course, once again, he happens to be in his brother's state, because the brother Jeb Bush was governor there. I think there's little doubt that in the wider scheme of things, the real power, the real neocon power, the visible power, was with Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. And Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld's relationship goes back, now it goes back 45 years, but back even then, it went back over 30 years. And I think, we got to look at some of the players, particularly the likes of Donald Rumsfeld, and we'll see how many events, global events, very significant events, the likes of Donald Rumsfeld has had a hand in. Now, Dick Cheney, of course, at the time of being sworn in, was the chairman of Halliburton, which is the second largest oilfield services company on the planet, the largest being Schlumberger, which is my former company, and I was with Schlumberger from 1979 to 1998. He was chairman of Halliburton, and of course, I mean, the Bushes were steeped in oil, Texan oil, and Cheney, of course, is steeped in oil. And we'll look at some of the things post 9/11 that Cheney was able to implement, which have also had a very, very significant, and are still having a very significant impact on global events. But so Cheney, I believe, was in the chair at the time of the morning of September the 11th. And, George Bush was, of course, taken by surprise when his Secret Service agent whispered in his ear that the U.S. was under attack. And he was taken into a separate room, where, of course, he was given a full debriefing before getting on a plane. Now, there is some evidence to suggest that he may have balked when he was on the plane, and not given the impression that he didn't actually want to be part of something of this order of magnitude, because it is clear that Air Force One was actually threatened. And he was told, or basically, I think word was put in his ear that either he, got in line, got with the program, or Air Force One was going to be taken down. And of course, Air Force One could have quite easily been taken down, and it would have just added to the fervour, the patriotic fervour that came about, obviously by design, post 9/11, where anybody, anywhere in the world challenging the integrity of the US was immediately dismissed as a nutter, as a conspiracy theorist. The whole world was in mourning, with the US. But meanwhile, whilst the world was in mourning, Dick Cheney and his oil field buddies were now using this, of course, because, literally within hours they had identified Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda as the perpetrators of this, despite the fact that, the alleged 19 hijackers were primarily Saudis. But immediately the blame was being leveled at Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and Osama bin Laden was designated as being hiding in a cave in Afghanistan, which legitimized the reason for invading Afghanistan, literally, 5-6 weeks after 9/11. But the real purpose of invading Afghanistan was twofold. It was primarily I say primarily, depends which side of the fence you sit on, I guess, but primarily it was to get the Taliban to agree to building a pipeline across the country, which they had previously resisted. And in fact, it's a matter of public record. It was put into the public domain by an Egyptian diplomat who was at the meeting, where the US representative told the Taliban, who in mid-August of 2001, the Taliban were rejecting the US overtures to build this pipeline across the country. And the US representative said, "We're offering you a carpet of gold. If you don't take this, what you're going to get is a carpet of bombs." So less than 6 weeks after 9/11, Afghanistan is targeted. The world just sits back and watches, because obviously it's been legitimized by the link between Osama bin Laden and the fact that he's been given sanctuary in a cave complex somewhere in Afghanistan.
Yeah. And then Saddam Hussein gets written into the script as well.
Well, hang on a second, because the other reason, of course, that the invasion of Afghanistan was so crucial at that time was because the opium supply had basically, the poppy supply for opium trade and heroin trade had basically dried up, because the Taliban had effectively shut down poppy growing and the trading of the poppies from Afghanistan. And of course, this was hurting the international heroin trade, and that was the secondary reason for the invasion of Afghanistan.
So it always struck me that Bush Jr. was a reluctant president. He struck me as somebody that had been coerced into that position, and he really didn't feel comfortable with it. There's some footage I saw on YouTube that you might be familiar with, where he's on his ranch in Crawford, Texas, and he's got his dog, Barney, and he's talking about Barney digging in the ground for bugs and stuff, and he seems really happy. He seems in his domain. He just loves being on his ranch with his dogs. That's his natural state. But whenever he was up on a podium and he was fulfilling his political requirements, he just seemed completely uncomfortable with it. There's this interview where he gets asked a question and his only answer is, "There's a time for politics." He just can't think. He can't formulate a sentence. He's got nothing to offer. And he just seems a very reluctant individual. Whereas you could contrast that with Tony Blair, who was his best buddy at the time, and he seemed a very dark character to me that was absolutely down with the agenda and very much relished his role in it. But I think there probably would have been a reason why they wanted a figurehead like Bush in place, and they would have wanted him not too up on the knowledge, as we just discussed there.
Well, I mean, I think that we can safely say that George Bush Sr. was in on the plan.
Far more of an architect.
Oh, of course. And I mean, what people don't realise is that George Bush Sr. actually had 3 terms at the helm. People think that he only had 1 term as president, but of course he had 2 terms as vice president to Ronald Reagan. Yeah. And in fact, the attempted assassination on Reagan was a failed attempt to get George Bush into the presidency by default.
Yeah, that's how I see it.
Because the assassination. I mean, that's a whole different subject, of course, but the assassination attempt on Reagan, once again, the official version of events is not supported by the evidence that's in the public domain. And what people aren't aware of is that an exercise had been planned for the following day, and the exercise was the swearing in of the vice president into the office of president in the event that anything untoward should ever happen to Ronald Reagan.
So it's an early rendering of the famous safety drills kind of thing.
Exactly. Well, of course, that didn't come about because Reagan survived. And actually, Reagan made it a very interesting comment when he was asked in a press conference about the attempt on his life. And he made the observation, he said, you know what, I didn't feel any pain until I was lying in the back of the car with my bodyguard on top of me. And, there is the conjecture that actually he was shot by the bodyguard. And unfortunately, the bodyguard didn't actually make it a kill shot, unfortunately for George Bush Sr., rather.
Yeah.
But anyway, the bottom line is obviously Reagan stayed in office. There was no way they were going to try that kind of stunt again, because Reagan was actually quite popular amongst the American people.
And the guy that is said to have shot Reagan, John Hinckley Jr., the Hinckley family, I believe, was closely associated with the Bushes in terms of they were ostensibly friends of theirs. And
absolutely, and Hinckley's brother actually had dinner with some members of the Bush family the previous night.
Exactly, which puts me in mind of the Bin Laden situation, because the Bushes were very much in bed with the Bin Ladens, with business deals and close personal friendships and all sorts. So you have these 2 families that were closely woven into the Bushes' inner circle that were both kind of stitched up for these events which came to pass.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, these are the sort of people you don't want to get too close to, because they will use you, abuse you, and destroy you if it suits their longer-term agenda.
Absolutely, with friends like these.
Yeah, exactly.
So the legacy of 9/11 in terms of the body count kind of speaks for itself when you factor in Iraq, Afghanistan, and everything else that's gone on in the wake of it. But the flip side of that whole dynamic is that event served as a wake-up call for so many people around the world, and it set them on a path towards seeking truth and seeing through the illusion which may well not have happened otherwise. It was an essential catalyst for so many people. So it's interesting to reflect on how fewer people there would be on this path now if it hadn't been for that event waking them out of their slumber. Do you think this is a process that would have been foreseen by the perpetrators and they just had to consider it kind of collateral damage? Or do you think that they fundamentally underestimated the degree to which this would wake so many people up? Do you think they've overestimated our ignorance?
I think there's a few factors that have served us very well, and that is I think that they did assume that some people would work it out, just like some people had worked out the scam of Pearl Harbor. I mean, I'm not saying Pearl Harbor wasn't bombed, but the Japanese were baited into attacking Pearl Harbor.
Sure.
As Admiral Husband Kimmel was the fool guy there. He was the guy that was sacrificed. They even alleged that he was partying and was hosting an orgy on the night of December 6th, 1941. To demonize him, and he died a broken man. His family tried, for 40, 50 years to clear his name. And the closest they ever got was Bill Clinton. And ironically, Bill Clinton made this observation just a few months before Zbigniew Brzezinski published his book, The Grand Chessboard, in which Brzezinski actually alludes to the fact that many Americans now are now aware that the U.S. administration baited the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor to give them the opportunity to bring the country into the Second World War, which is why, of course, Brzezinski made the same observation that the American public, would not be willing to support the U.S. hegemonic agenda without this catastrophic and catalyzing event. And of course, he was then effectively plagiarized by PNAC a few years later.
Right.
But so Clinton basically said that Admiral Husband Kimmel was an American hero. Now that may not sound very much, but in political terms, that is as close as the American administration are ever going to get to effectively apologizing to the Kimmel family for putting Admiral Kimmel through the trauma that they did post 41. And of course, as we know, if somebody unfortunately has to be sacrificed as the collateral, then so be it. It doesn't matter who the hell they are; they just go by the wayside.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think they did calculate the number of people who would start to question the events, but neither did they take into account the technological advancements that would manifest as a result of the internet.
Right.
Because, back in 2000, the internet was still relatively young. I mean, the internet, I can remember in Schlumberger. Now, Schlumberger was right at the forefront because Schlumberger had its own intranet as early as 1990.
Wow.
And that was literally, obviously, we didn't have Windows, so, you just had to go into your computer, and either your computer was on your email or it was on something else. It couldn't do more than one operation at a time. And it was the advent of Windows technology that basically provided people with the facility to, do multitasking.
Yeah.
So, we, at that time, which was about 91, maybe 92, maybe a bit later. But, that was the very, very first time that we started to realize that the intranet actually had the potential to be a much wider resource, tap into other intranets, and then eventually by 95, 96, it became the internet. So even in 2001, the internet was still only about 6 years old.
Yeah.
And the number of people connected to the internet around the world was still, fairly limited. I mean, personal computers weren't, a phenomena at the time. So people who were connected were generally connected because they were connected through their work. But after 9/11, I think the level of interest, the level of curiosity, and the parallel, although unconnected, advancement of technology and the reduction in prices, so it made the internet available to everyone. I mean, bear in mind, this is still 3 years before broadband was available. So this was all still dial-up. So it was quite, a laborious process to get in there and do your research. And it was quite slow because you were lucky if you got more than about, 50 bytes, of data per second.
I remember those days.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm just reminiscing here because it was hard going. But what it did was, as people started to realize that there was something not right about the official version of events of 9/11, they started to look at other events. And then we had, so we had the Madrid bombings, and then we had the London bombings. And I think in the UK, it was the London bombings that sent the burgeoning truth movement exponential.
Yeah.
Because there were so many things about the London bombings that didn't stack up, and of course, for me, like for many other people, it was about 5:20 in the afternoon because I was watching the coverage because I was looking for the slip ups, and the defining moment for me was about 5:20 in the afternoon of July the 7th, and it was the interview with Peter Power.
Yes.
where he said that coincidentally, earlier today, we were running exercises at exactly the same 3 stations where the bombs went off this morning.
And imagine our surprise.
Imagine our surprise, exactly. And so, obviously that started mine and, a lot of other people's curiosity. And I think that, anybody today who has spent any time looking at the events of July 7th knows very much that was a staged event. And this is the way the establishment works. They work on the basis that, they know there's a number of people who know what's going on.
Sure.
And they like to give us the finger, like they did at the at Tavistock Square on the side of the bus.
Oh, yeah.
It
mock
was
us.
the outright terror, bold and brilliant.
Yeah.
It was the hoarding for the film The Descent. But it was giving the finger. It was giving the finger to those people who know what's occurring. And their attitude is, we know there's some of you out there who know what's going on, but it's not enough.
But what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, what are you going to do about it? And we can control the narrative. And, of course, that's unfortunately still the case. They do control the narrative, although their grip on the narrative is starting to become a little slippery, to say the least.
Yeah. It can be considered bad timing, I guess, on their part, the fact that the internet was starting to grow exponentially, as you said, at the time that this event went down in 2001. And people have different theories on why the internet was introduced. A general consensus seems to be that it was all about spying and surveillance and data gathering, and it's probably served its purpose to a certain extent in that regard. But also, it's caused people to be able to do research that just was not possible in the days when you had to go to libraries and get books and stuff. And, it's caused a lot of people around the world to be straight on top of one of these false flag events the minute they're pulled off and starting to exchange and share information about it. And that's something they've just had to live with as collateral damage, I guess, from their point of view.
Absolutely. And there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that had we had the internet available in 91, then I think people would have realised that the whole of Gulf War I was a contrived event.
Right.
What was common knowledge, and again, we're coming back to the same players, Donald Rumsfeld, going into Iraq and meeting with Saddam and budding up with Saddam. And of course, we know that the Americans were openly providing armaments to Iraq for their war with Iran over the Shatt al-Arab waterway. And we also know, of course, that Oliver North, through the Iran-Contra affair, was effectively providing the funding for weapons to be shipped into Iran. Because, if you want to stimulate a war, you've got to make sure that both sides have got the right toys to do it with. And eventually in 1988, both Iran and Iraq realized that, they were being stitched up by the Americans. So, they just agreed to sort of go back to the original borders and stop lobbing shells at each other. Well, that didn't really please the Americans, because obviously what the Americans were trying to do was to make sure that neither Iran or Iraq could devote the resources to develop its oil fields to challenge the supremacy of Saudi Arabia as the global, or the most significant provider of global hydrocarbons. So they wanted to keep both Iran and Iraq sort of not off the market completely necessarily, but certainly restrict their ability to produce. Well, after they ended that campaign in 88, then they wanted to find another way to keep Iraqi oil off the market. So they contrived to bait Saddam into attacking Kuwait, and they did that by getting the Kuwaiti oil company, and it was primarily the American employees working for the Kuwaiti oil company, to directionally drill into the neutral zone, which was an area that was designated as no man's land between Kuwait and Iraq. And they did it in such a way that obviously the Iraqi engineers would know that the Kuwaiti rigs were drilling into the neutral zone. And so basically Saddam let it be known he wasn't very impressed, and he sought advice from April Glaspie, who was the American ambassador to Iraq at the time. He sought advice from Glaspie, and she basically said, I am instructed to advise you that the American government has no interest in Arab-Arab conflict, or no interest in getting involved. in Arab conflict. And in the video footage of that meeting, you can see that in response, Saddam offers a sort of wry smile, because he effectively takes her statement as a green light from the US government to invade Kuwait, which of course he did at the start of August of 91. Now, then we had the Desert Shield program. We had this big build-up of the US military in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait, on the border of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And then in January, about January the 15th or so, the bombing started. And then literally about 2-3 weeks later, the land war started, where there was a massive surge of troops into Kuwait to force the Iraqi troops back out of Kuwait and into Iraq. And what people remember of that was that the retreating Iraqi troops set the oil wells alight. But it wasn't retreating Iraqi troops, it was American Special Forces who set the wells alight in Kuwait.
Yep.
And the reason they set the wells alight was to demonize Saddam in the eyes of the world, so that the US could then get the UN to apply sanctions on Iraq and therefore keep Iraqi oil off of the global market, which they did, by the way, until May of 2003. And that was, of course, 2 months or so after the second Gulf War. This was the illegal invasion of Iraq. And of course, what people remember is George W. Bush swooping into the USS, I want to say Lincoln, but that might not be right, but whatever it was, he swooped in on the aircraft carrier. And what people will remember is the big sign behind him that said mission accomplished. And a lot of people think that mission accomplished was a statement that the ground war was over and that basically Saddam had been toppled. No, that mission accomplished was a signal to the global financial community that from this day forward, Iraqi oil would once again be traded in US dollars, because the final trigger for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was the fact that in the immediate aftermath of George W. Bush being awarded the presidency by the Supreme Court, Saddam had announced that from that moment forward, Iraqi oil would be traded in euros.
Right.
Thereby putting the US petrodollar under stress. And in fact, over the period, the US dollar fell by some 20-odd% against other global currencies. And so that's why they had to have that second invasion to re-establish the petrodollar as the global reserve currency.
And there's so much evidence to show that 9/11 was planned years or decades in advance. We got all the examples of predictive programming that's encoded into movies and music videos and stuff, which is what I get into in my public talks. Yep. But you've also got the fact that the World Trade Center towers were constructed under the watch of David Rockefeller, basically one of the chief architects of the plan, and he's still alive today at 101. And he was in New York on the day of September 11th to view the towers coming down. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this event was planned back in the 1960s, if not before. And there's a very real sense in which this was an event that stood above and beyond all the others that they've pulled off. This was really important. It was a real strategic one for them, wasn't it? It was designed to change so much.
Absolutely. And I mean, if we look at the sort of occult symbolism, the Tower Tarot card is the 16th card of the major arcana.
Yeah.
And the Tower Tarot card, and if people look at the I'm just trying to think of the artist, but it's one of the most common depictions of the Tower Tarot card. Her name will come to me in a second, but I mean, it does look like 9/11. You've got a lightning bolt hitting the top of the tower. You've got the top of the tower leaning over, just like happened with World Trade Center 2. It toppled over before it sort of crumbled into dust, and you got people falling out of the tower.
Yeah.
So if you look at what occurred on 9/11, it's almost like a depiction. Rider-Waite. It's the Rider-Waite tarot cards, and if you look at the depiction on the Rider-Waite tarot card of the tower, it's almost like it was recreated on 9/11. And the meaning of the Tower Tarot card, if you draw the Tower Tarot card, it means that everything in your life is probably about to have the rug pulled out from under it. You're about to go through a very, very significant change in your whole life's path. And that, of course, is exactly what occurred here.
Yeah, it goes back to this notion that modern history can be divided into two halves, before and after September 11th, 2001, and in many ways it can.
Without any shadow of doubt. I mean, the 90s, I was living in the US, well, I lived in the Middle East through the early 90s, and in the US through the mid-90s. And, until Tony Blair manipulated Bill Clinton into bombing in the Balkans, the world was at relative peace. I mean, in the period of probably 93 through to late 97, early 98, the world was at relative peace. I mean, I was traveling extensively, and it was an absolute pleasure. It was before the days of the outrageous security checks that we have at airports today.
Yeah.
And then, yes, absolutely, this all changed. But just to come back to your point, I do agree with you that this has been very, very significant. And if it wasn't for 9/11, then there certainly wouldn't be the level of curiosity amongst people from right around the world, not just looking at global events like this, but I mean also obviously subsequent to this we've had the global financial collapse of 2007/8. And today, consequently, we've got a lot more people who understand the fraud of fractional reserve banking, the fraud of the central banking system, the relationship between the central banking system and the iron grip that the global banksters have on national governments, the way in which effectively the world is in debt slavery. So, coupled with awareness of things like, GM foods and geoengineering and fluoridation of water and, the eradication of natural farming and the attempt to literally destroy or eradicate all natural health products, the acceleration of vaccine agenda, particularly amongst the youth. And people are starting to see that there is connectivity here. That it's not a war on terror, it's a war on humanity. And basically the goal of the globalists is to try to ensure that humanity is so dumbed down that basically it will fulfill its role as a debt slave and be grateful that it's allowed to eke out an existence without sort of overt threat. But the good news is, I think that where we're getting to now, and maybe it might appear that there's a few events that are a bit unconnected here, but what we're getting to now is that the truth movement, fortunately, is also going to go through, I think, a sort of fairly significant evolution, or maybe revolution, because the days for there just being a truth movement are effectively over. 9/11 certainly triggered the rise of the truth movement, i.e. those people who were purely researching to try to understand what's occurring.
Yeah.
And people will still need to do that, of course, because that's the nursery. But now people need to graduate. They need to graduate from the truth movement, which is basically just one of, I've got an intellectual interest in trying to understand what occurred, rather than just believing the lies and the BS that's pumped out by the mainstream media. But now it's got to go to the next level. It's got to become activism. And, as I've just outlined, there are so many areas where humanity is being put under assault at the moment that, no one person or no one group can address every angle of attack. But it doesn't matter which issue it is that people pick up on, but they need to pick up on something. So, we need to get people to get away from the pure research, the pure desire to have an intellectual understanding of what occurred, to actually start getting involved and become active in bringing about the change. And as you well know, Mark, because I know you've discussed it before, those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers, they do have, I wouldn't say rules, but they have parameters that they feel they have to abide by.
Yeah.
And one of those parameters is that they have to tell us what they're doing.
Exactly.
They have to tell us what the game plan is, so that when we don't step up to the plate and don't challenge it, then they just say, well, thanks very much, guys. We told you what we were going to do. You haven't made any attempt to prevent us from doing it.
Yep.
So we're just going to get on with it.
So you're okay with it?
You're okay with it, exactly.
Yep, couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And it's my personal opinion that the controllers would have real trouble trying to pull off another event of the magnitude of 9/11 now. Obviously, we get lots of these lower level false flag things happening all the time to achieve one aim or another. But to pull off something of the scale of that would alert so many people to it, I feel, now, and would have so many people calling foul and really investigating it that they're going to have some real problems with that. I think that's something that's changed in those 15 years since 9/11, because so many people are on the path of questioning the official version of everything now. How do you feel about that?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, it's almost exactly a little over 10 years now. But 10 years ago, I was invited to participate in a 9/11 conference in Chicago. And this was being held over the first weekend of June in Chicago in 2006.
Yep.
And about, I guess probably about two and a half months before I was due to go to Chicago, I had this real sense of foreboding. I mean, there was just something not right. And eventually I sort of just allowed my intuition to follow. And I started thinking, well, hang on a second, this conference in Chicago is the first weekend of June. I think I was due to speak on the 3rd of June, Saturday, the 3rd of June. And I thought, well, shit, this is the weekend before the 6th of the 6th, 2006.
Great story.
And I thought, they're not going to let this pass without doing something. So I thought, okay, well, let's have a look. Let's just have a random check here. I thought, where's the zip code 666? Sorry, 60606. Well, 60606 is Sears Tower, or whatever it's called now. It's got a new name now, but it's Sears Tower, Chicago. And I thought, oh my God, how coincidental is that? And I thought, well, let's have a look at 60666. Well, 60666 is O'Hare Airport, Chicago. And then I thought, well, okay, maybe they're going to get real cute here and go for 60018, i.e. 3 times 6. And that was the zip code of the hotel where the conference was being held.
Couldn't make it up.
Well, hang on a second, and you can tell I'm not making it up, because this is actually the presentation. I gave a joint presentation with Annie Mashal. And the video of that presentation is up online. And I'm outlining this in this presentation, and you can actually hear the audience gasp as I'm sort of unfolding this. And I said, so look, there's a few other things you need to take account of. Is because I've also done a bit of research here, and Larry Silverstein took control of the lease of Sears Tower just literally a few weeks before the conference. And not only that, but Sears Tower had been closed for the previous 2 weekends, including the weekend of the conference, because of rewiring of the security system.
Oh shit!
And I said, do you start to see there's a script similarity here between what's going on in Chicago right now and what's occurring, or what occurred on 9/11.
Was it an Israeli security firm?
Well, funny you should say that. But wait, it gets better. So. At the end of the day, I mean, obviously that presentation got quite a buzz going around the event, and the organisers asked me if I'd be prepared to speak to a couple of local news crews, one on the Saturday evening and one on the Sunday morning. And then they also asked me if I'd give the presentation again to people that hadn't seen it, so that, obviously we could get the wider word out. And there were people in the room. I mean, there was some guy called Alex Jones sitting right down in front of me. Mm-hmm. He paid me a massive compliment, actually. I think I was the only speaker he didn't interrupt the whole weekend.
Compliment indeed.
High praise. and there was a guy called Ralph Schoeneman who had a radio show in New York. There was a lady called Bonnie, somebody who had a radio show called Guns and Butter in California. And I said, guys, look, get it out there, because I said, I may be wrong, but on the other hand, it's quite coincidental. And if we don't put it out there and it does go down, then obviously, we're going to be kicking ourselves. So anyway, I did a couple of interviews. As far as I'm aware, they were put out on local TV stations, although there's no remaining evidence of that. Anyway, now go to your search engine and punch in Sears Tower terror attack 2006. And what you'll find is that I think it was on June the 16th or 17th or thereabouts. So a little over a week after the conference, a terror cell was arrested in Miami with detailed plans of Sears Tower.
Well, I'm just going to
and that it was a construct, because it was a terror cell with some obscure name that no one's ever heard of.
The Liberty City 7.
If you just looked it up.
Yeah, small Miami, Florida-based religious group. Universal Divine Saviors, there you go.
Yeah, and so they're the poor patsies that are now languishing in jail, because they were being set up, obviously, to perpetrate something in Chicago in 2006. But unfortunately, some of us were, watching what was occurring and looking at the similarities in the script. And just maybe, by getting the word out, we thwarted it.
Well, I think we need to consider this, because something else we've spoken about is the London Olympics of 2012 and all the symbolic clues and all the stuff in popular culture in the years leading up to 2012 that seemed to indicate that something big was planned in terms of a terror event for that, spectacle. And this brings in the work of Rick Clay, of course. And
yes.
you and I have speculated before on whether the large number of researchers that got on board with that information and started sharing it before that event may well have prevented something big from going down, because the controllers would have seen that many people were starting to look at this stuff, and it would have just been a bit too audacious on their part to then go ahead and carry it off, because so many people would be calling foul on it afterwards. So I think we do need to consider the impact that we can have by sharing information about these events beforehand and potentially preventing them from happening. I think that's a very real dynamic.
Absolutely. And I think also, you mentioned Rick Clay, and that's a very sad story. But Rick Clay, unbeknown to me, was actually at my Glastonbury Symposium presentation in 2007.
Right.
Where I gave a presentation called Fool Me Once. And this was very shortly after the London Olympics logo had been unveiled. And it was at that presentation, and the video of this is online, it was at that presentation where I presented my conjecture that the logo spelled out Zion. So I named the Olympics the Project Zion.
Sure.
And Rick Clay took away, that presentation and decided to research it for himself. And obviously what he put into the public domain is absolutely fantastic and was sensational. And the way that happened was that I did an interview with Red Ice in, I think it was about February or March of 2008. And the first hour I did on Codex Alimentarius, because actually at that time I was spending as much time as possible trying to get the natural health community aware of the Codex Alimentarius agenda to destroy their industry. And in the private hour, I put forward my conjecture about the London Olympics. And of course, the Palmgren brothers, Hendrik does the comparing, and his brother Frederick does the research.
Yeah.
And whilst they were talking to me, they were doing their research, and they came up with some stuff that Rick Clay had posted online. And they contacted Rick, and Rick actually did 4 straight hours with them on the research that he had done into the London Olympics and the symbolism of the London Olympics.
Right.
And that was really what took it viral. And then, sadly, of course, a few months later, Rick tragically took his own life. And and I know there's a lot of speculation over that, but he, as far as I'm concerned, it was a terrible tragedy, but there is nothing more to it than the fact that he was unfortunately somewhat disturbed, and he did indeed unfortunately have an unfortunate drug trip, and ended up effectively committing suicide. Sure. But there's no question that Rick left his mark big time, because what I'd put out there was probably never going to get beyond the immediate community of the Glastonbury Symposium, if you like. But what Rick did was Rick took it, ran with the ball, took it to a whole new level, got it out there, and of course, what it did was it triggered a whole lot of other people to do the research. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. By the time 2012 came around, everyone, even Russell Brand, I remember seeing an interview with him where he said he was really nervous because he'd read all the conjecture about a possible significant event at the closing ceremony, and he was really nervous about participating. But of course, he did. Now, whether or not we got close to something, I think we also have to recognise the work of Michael Shrimpton here, because Michael Shrimpton was, I should say, in some quarters is, a very well respected Queen's Counsel, a very experienced barrister with a lot of specialist security work, i.e. cases, under his belt. And
he was at AV7 this year?
He did speak at AV7, indeed, he did, yes. And he spoke at AV7 because of the experience that he had after uncovering a plot. He had uncovered a plot to plant a nuclear device in the stadium, which was then due to be set off at the closing ceremony. And Michael used his contacts in the government, and he was told what he needed to do was contact the British Security Services by using their hotline. So now this you got to remember, this is a guy who is a senior Queen's Counsel. So he believes he's got so much evidence that there is a plot to plant this nuclear device and effectively sort of do a 9/11 or 7/7 part 2, reports it to the security services, and they end up arresting him. And in fact, they ended up not only arresting him, but dragging him through the court system, charging him with making sort of false accusations, wasting police time. And he ended up actually serving time in jail. And this is, so, what kind of message does this send? That, if you stumble across something, the last thing you need to do is actually contact the British Security Services, because you're likely to be arrested, charged, and end up serving prison time. Yep. So the smart thing to do is if you do, and this is the way most of us work, is if we do uncover something that we sense has some potential legs, then we just put it out in the public domain and see where it goes.
Shout it from the rooftops.
Exactly, shout it from the rooftops. But poor old Michael, fortunately, he's a solid character, and he puts it down to experience, and he makes light of it. And his AV7 presentation was outstanding, but his legal career has been destroyed. Yeah. And for anybody who's listening to this and is looking for an after dinner speaker or a speaker at an event, then I'd recommend that you make contact with Michael Shrimpton. He's very entertaining. He's very self-effacing, and he's been put through the ringer by the establishment for doing what he thought was the right thing.
Yeah. And this is the sort of thing that Ole Damagard is always talking about as well, with regard to false flag terror events and all these hoaxes using crisis actors, which is his specialist area. He says if ever you feel that one of these is about to be carried off, or they're about to pull off one of their famous safety drills, and you can see the film set being constructed, then take photographs, talk about it, tell people, make postings, let them know that we notice this stuff and we're prepared to shout it to anyone that will listen, because that's the only process that's going to throw a spanner in the works and cause problems. Because every time one of these events gets postponed, it really screws things up in terms of their timeline. And we can reflect on the 2012 Olympics thing in that respect. You know, there would have been a plan for that event to have paved the way for many other things. And if we succeeded collectively in not allowing that event to take place, it would have really screwed up their plans. And we need more of that.
Absolutely. And, you know, the difference between now and 2001 is very significant, you know, because back then, you know, let's say the half dozen of us that were at least aware of each other who were trying to dig through the debris, if you like, of 9/11, you know, and we were having to really get down and deep down into the minutiae, into the detail. Now, I'll be totally honest with you, when something goes down, I sit back.
Yeah.
You know, I sit back and just wait for all of the, you know, people who are motivated to dig into the detail to put it into the public domain. And then I get the opportunity to sift through it, you know, and obviously then put the pieces of the jigsaw together.
That's right.
And,
There'll be
you know,
YouTube
that's
videos
fantastic.
within a couple of hours.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, why do you think we don't hear anything more about Joe Cox's murder? I am going to make the effort to go to the court case with Tommy Mayer, because there is so much about the Joe Cox assassination, murder, whatever, that doesn't add up. That I think that at the court case, just like with 7/7, you know, those people who get to witness it firsthand can see for themselves how the establishment works to try and shut down the dissent.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, by the way, the judge that's been appointed to hear the Tommy Mayer case is the same judge that heard the Lee Rigby case. It's Judge Nigel Swinney.
Okay.
So, you know, he's a safe pair of hands. But, you know, it is absolutely essential that, you know, people do their research, they look at it, and it doesn't matter how crazy something might seem, you know, put it out there, because it may actually be a piece of the jigsaw that somebody else needs to actually complete the picture. You know, so no piece of information is too crazy. What we do have to actually practice is discretion and discernment.
Absolutely.
You know, and we also do have to avoid, you know, crying wolf. So, you know, whilst I agree that, I mean, it's important to call out events. And I mean, in the last 15 years, I've called out 3 events. The Chicago event, the London Olympics, and in an episode of Humanity versus Insanity back in April, and in a newsletter in April, I made the observation that we would probably see a false flag event of some description in the immediate run-up to the EU referendum. And I made the observation that it wasn't rocket science to make that observation, because that's exactly what had occurred in Sweden in 2003, when Sweden's foreign minister, Anna Lindh, who was a beautiful female politician, who was very vocal in proposing that Sweden join the euro, and the referendum that was scheduled in September of 2003 to allow the people to decide whether Sweden joined the euro or retained its own currency. And Anna Lindh was pro-euro, but even though she was assassinated, and there's some very strange things about that assassination as well, the vote went against. And of course, Sweden retained its krona. Yeah. And so I was predicting something similar in the UK prior to the EU referendum. And of course, we had the Joe Cox event. And if you punch in Joe Cox to any search engine now, what you immediately see is the plethora of people who have taken the event apart. And consequently, the British establishment now just wants Joe Cox to be completely forgotten, because they don't want people literally digging the dirt on this, because it just doesn't stack up. Yep. And one of the things that I would predict is that at some juncture in the not too distant future, we will find that either quietly Brendan Cox, Joe Cox's husband, has emigrated to the States with the kids.
Indeed.
Or he makes an announcement that, to sort of try and forget the tragedy of what occurred in Batley, I'm going to take the children and we're going to move to the US, because it's my conjecture that there's a very good possibility that Jo Cox was moved to the US. I mean, she and Brendan both worked for Obama in his 2008 campaign in West Virginia. So it wouldn't shock me to learn that Brendan and the children are migrating to reunite with Jo. Now, what leads me to make such an outrageous observation? Well, take a look at the video of the family, and in fact, it's Jo Cox's sister reading an 8-minute eulogy in the town square, not even a couple of days later.
Yep.
And it's almost like she's trying to stifle laughter.
It's like she's at a stand-up comedy gig.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The family don't look in the least bit distraught.
And
if you listen very carefully to what she says, I think she's giving the game away.
Yeah. Giving us the opportunity to know.
Yes.
Yeah.
We live in interesting times, Mark.
Well, we sure
very,
do,
very interesting times. And I, let me sort of change as we're coming to the end of probably my contribution here. But consider the possibility, and I know it sounds outrageous, but consider the possibility that I'm not suggesting that these entities are aware of what they're doing. But in the greater scheme of things, what they are doing is they actually are giving humanity an opportunity to evolve. An opportunity for humanity to actually realize, who we truly are and what we are truly capable of. And it's a bit like, if you're training as a sportsman, you only really improve your game if you play against people that are better than you.
That's right.
Or people that have more experience. And these guys, they're very, very good at what they do. Take nothing away from them. They are sociopathic. This is the cremation of care culture. Basically you do whatever you have to do, regardless of the consequences, to achieve your greater goals.
Oh, they're worthy adversaries for sure.
They are indeed worthy adversaries, and but we're now rising into the challenge, and of course, there's way more of us than there is of them.
Sure.
We are able to bring far more creativity in challenging their agenda, and the beauty is that we don't have a strategy per se, because they're controlling all the shots right now. So we have to be reactive. But, it's quite remarkable that the more experience we get, then, the more opportunity we have to think and plan about how we will react when or if something happens. And, just because there's so many now doing this, and we don't need the whole world to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
But even if it's just 3 or 4% of the people who realize that, there is an agenda occurring here that does not have humanity's best interests at heart. And if I'm literally now, a week or so short of my 60th birthday. And, if we can't leave a legacy for future generations that is going to serve them, as opposed to just push them further into debt slavery, then we will be remiss in terms of the remaining time that we have on this mortal coil.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I've reflected on all of that many times myself, and absolutely go along with that. And we were chatting yesterday about how this year, 2016, is a year of the great revealing. And actually the word apocalypse breaks down as a revealing of great truths. And going back to the 666 symbology, that number that you mentioned earlier on, 2016, or at least 216, if you take out the 0, is 6 times 6 times 6. So
yes.
That's kind of interesting.
It is indeed, isn't it? I mean, I think we have to move forward without having too much attachment. I mean, this is something that I've been sharing ever since I had the good fortune to spend some time with the Cuero in Peru in 2010, and that's a whole nother story. But there's a couple of pieces of wisdom that they shared with me while I was there, and one is that to actually participate in bringing about the change in of itself isn't enough. You have to actually visualize. You have to visualize the sort of world that you're trying to bring about, but without having an existential attachment to your vision. Because if you have too much of an existential attachment to your vision, you may actually be limiting the outcome by your own limitations of perception. So give it your best shot, but recognize and understand that our own perception may actually be a limiting factor, and so say, well, we're prepared to go beyond that if there's something better.
Yeah. But
that in of itself is not enough, because once you've visualized, you take that opportunity to visualize. I don't mean meditate, I mean just sitting quietly every now and again, just thinking about how you would like to see something unfold, how you'd like to see it change. But then find a way to actually get involved and do it. And as I said earlier, it doesn't matter what it is that you pick up, but pick up on something. Because, if everybody sits back and says, oh, well, I don't need to get involved because, so-and-so's got my back, so-and-so's taking care of that, we got Greenpeace, we got Friends of the Earth, we got this NGO, we got that NGO, I don't need to do anything. I can just sort of sit back and watch X Factor or Strictly or whatever. Yeah. And that's what the establishment want. The establishment wants people to not participate, because while you're not participating, you're not an obstacle to them. You're not in their way, and they can carry on doing whatever atrocity they want to do.
Yep.
But if we get involved, and it literally, like I said, it just needs probably 3 or 4% of the population to get involved, to start letting elected representatives know that they are being scrutinized on every decision, on every activity that they undertake, and to remind them that they are elected as representatives of the people, not as lackeys for the corporations.
Yeah. Great stuff. And I really love the fact that you go into the realms of consciousness and spirituality and metaphysical stuff, as well as the, conspiracy, hard fact stuff. I feel that if you just focus on the geopolitical aspect, the real world so-called aspect of things, you're not taking it far enough in terms of finding those solutions and fitting it all into the big picture. So that's great stuff. Is there anywhere that you'd like to direct people to online to find some more of your work? And do you want to shout out AV8 yet, or is it too early for that still?
No, AV8. I mean, half the tickets have already been sold for AV8, which I think is a testimony to the enjoyment that people got. Because I mean, obviously, it's a full-on event. AV events are a full-on weekend. Something like, 13, 14 presentations. But, of course, the purpose of the AV events is to bring people together under one roof for 3 days, like-minded people. You put them in a nice venue where, the accommodation's good quality, the food's good quality. Because I've learned the hard way. If you try and host an event on the cheap, if anything goes wrong, if the rooms are all full, cold, too hot, damp, whatever, or the food's crap, that's what people remember. So you have to take all the basics away, and what people remember is the quality of the event, the quality of the speakers, and the quality of the opportunity that they have to spend time with like-minded people. And for me, the great thing about AV events is all the stuff that happens that I don't even know about.
Right.
Just because people hook up with each other and find that they have common interests on something. Okay. And so here we are now coming up to AV8 in 2017.
And that's May, is it? May again?
It is May. It's the third weekend of May. And I haven't got the final list of speakers yet, because obviously things move so fast, and I always like to ensure that the AV events are addressing current hot issues.
Yeah. Is it the same hotel, Hopwood House?
It's at the same place, yes, Horwood House,
Horwood
just
House.
outside Milton Keynes. Beautiful, beautiful venue. Staff were wonderful. Food was wonderful. I mean, everything about it was wonderful. I mean, I have to say, this is, I think, probably the first event that I've ever put on where I haven't heard a single negative comment about the whole event. I'm sure people had some minor whinges, but they weren't significant enough to get back to me. And the information on that is on alternativeview.co.uk. My archive of material is available on my website, which is ianrcrane.com. But then there's a lot of information as well. Obviously, the Humanity versus Insanity and Fracking Nightmare programs, they're up on my YouTube channel, and that's, again, Ian R. Crane.
Ian Crane's reflections on 9/11. As I mentioned at the start, this is a 2-part podcast, and part 2 features me chatting with Max Egan, getting his perspectives on this whole thing as we mark the 15th anniversary of that fateful day. Join me for that from the usual sources, my SoundCloud page, also via freemantv.com. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.